Coming up on this week's episode of the EV Resource Podcast, the Ford F-150 might not get a plug-in hybrid version after all. Renault kicks gas in China. Elon Musk and Sandy Munro talk to the Third Row Tesla podcast. And I want to introduce you to a new EV sports car that you likely haven't heard of yet. Well, hello, and welcome to the EV Resource Podcast. Once again, coming to you from my car. An update on Kevin's situation, actually. He has come home from the hospital, but he's going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. So bear with me. The audio quality, I know, is not of the studio, but luckily, it'll just be most likely a couple weeks of coming to you from the driver's seat here in the Chevy Spark EV. Once again, my name is Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and answer your questions about electric vehicles. I want to thank Titan Auto and Tire here in Moseley, Virginia, for their support for this podcast. Titan, as I'm sure you know by now, are one of the very few independent shops that are qualified to work on hybrids and electric vehicles. And from hybrids to Hummers, they can fix everything. If you are in the Central Virginia area, I definitely encourage you to take your vehicle to Titan, especially during these times. They have concierge service. They will actually come and pick up your car if you're within, I believe it's 10 miles of their 2 locations. So if your car or truck or van or SUV or whatever needs some work done, go ahead and take it over to Titan. They'll take really good care of you. So last week I started off the podcast with a story about Ford and the F-150 having a plug-in hybrid option for the powertrain for the upcoming model years. And it turns out that might not be the case. That Car and Driver might have gotten that original report wrong. So Mike Levine is an employee for Ford. He's actually the North American Product Communications Manager. And he put a tweet out this week saying that Car and Driver absolutely had that wrong, that Ford never said the F-150 will include a plug-in hybrid. Now, I think the wording of that is probably chosen very specifically, saying that Ford never said they will have a plug-in hybrid. He didn't say that Ford will not have a plug-in hybrid. So I think that's a very important distinction to point out, because they may well come up with a plug-in hybrid here. Hopefully, if they do decide to do that, it will have more than the 10 miles of range that was reported by Car and Driver. Likely, for a plug-in hybrid, honestly, at least in the U.S., to be taken seriously, it's got to have 30 to 40 miles of all-electric range. And that's because the average daily commute for most people is around 30 to 40 miles. So then that would satisfy that daily usage case, and then have the gas engine for those longer trips occasionally, or weekend trips or whatever. That is where the argument for plug-in hybrids really comes alive. If Ford makes a plug-in hybrid pickup truck, that is what it would need. It would have to have 30 to 40 miles of range before switching over to gasoline for it to be considered, I guess, a competitive argument in that space. Now, of course, there are no plug-in hybrid pickup trucks right now, so really Ford could come up with whatever they wanted, and we would all probably either laugh at them or rejoice, depending on what they ended up releasing. Ultimately, though, I think it's important to remember that Ford is going to have an all-electric version of the F-150 that they've developed. That is something that is worth getting excited about, because it'll likely have 250 to 300 mile range at least, and it's an F-150. Like I said last week, they sell more of these than any other vehicle in the United States. It is the number one selling vehicle, the F-Series platform. So not just the F-150. My apologies. Let me correct that. It's the entire F-Series lineup. But still, they sell a lot. So any plug, whether it's full electric, plug-in hybrid, or anything else, is definitely a step in the right direction. I hope that Mike's correction via tweet this week is not something that's going to kill the idea of a plug-in hybrid, just that they aren't talking about it or aren't ready to talk about it just yet. All right, so moving on. 2 days ago, Renault announced that they are going to stop making and selling gas-powered cars in China. China is the world's largest automotive market for EVs, so if they were going to do it, that is definitely the place to do it. No real surprise in terms of location, but to the best of my knowledge, they are the first legacy automaker that, has made gas and diesel powered vehicles for decades that has made any kind of announcement to immediately stop selling gas powered vehicles in any market around the world. So this is fantastic. Currently, Renault already has their KZE all electric city car launched in China back actually in 2019, which is a car that's produced by their EGT New Energy Automotive company, the joint venture with Nissan and a Chinese company, where Renault actually only has about 25% stake in the company right now. But in addition to that, they're also going to develop 4 new full electric EVs with, I'm going to mispronounce this, Jiangxi Group electric vehicle. I'm sure I've butchered that name. So, and they're actually going to have a larger stake, but still a minority at 49% in that venture with Brilliance Automotive Group to make all-electric light commercial vehicles. So they've got lots of big plans. Tesla right now is the only company that has been allowed to operate in China without having a partnership. So that's why Renault and Nissan and really Chevy and everybody else has these partnerships with local Chinese companies in order to make these EVs. Tesla is the only one that doesn't, so that's actually something that's rather unique. But Renault, their KZE all-electric city car right now is like a small crossover, and I'm going to show you a picture here because it is rather nondescript. If you ask me, it looks like a small crossover. It has a 26.8 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and here's the thing that is quite shocking about it. It is actually priced to about $9,000. Yes, you heard right, 9, after all of the incentives that China has built into the price. People can walk away paying about $9,000 for this, which is just spectacular. So Renault's official statement said with 860,000 electric vehicles sold in China in 2019, China is by far the largest EV market in the world. EV sales are expected to reach 25% of the Chinese market by 2030, which is actually huge. Group Renault was a pioneer on EVs and has sold close to 270,000 EVs in the world since 2011. It gives a strong competitive advantage in China, as shown by the successful launching of the Renault City KZE, the first joint venture EV car competing in a segment with best local automakers. It's interesting. This must have been translated from Chinese because it reads a little strange. They go on to say Group Renault expects to reinforce its partnership with Nissan and Dongfeng within EGT to make KZE a worldwide car, a derivative for Europe based on the Dacia Spring concept will be sold from 2021. So they've got big plans. I think that is fantastic. I really applaud them for being one of the very first, if not the first, automaker to go all EV and kick gas. I like that. So, definitely something to look forward to. If you're in North America, this probably doesn't apply all that much to us and what's going on over here, because we don't even have Renault. But certainly for China, and I think Europe probably has a lot to look forward to as well. So if you haven't seen it yet, the Third Row Tesla podcast is, of course, a podcast as well as YouTube channel. And in a recent episode, they had some very special guests. Sandy Munro, who of course has been working on the Tesla Model Y teardown. Previously, he had done Tesla Model 3. And then actually the other special guest was Elon Musk himself for a short period of time. And they got a chance to ask a couple questions and had Elon explain some of the design principles, the decision-making process of how they decided on building the Model Y the way they did. But more importantly, a couple of the design features that make the Model Y very unique. So they started off with talking about the heat pump and the octo valve. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical details about what the octo valve is and how it's working, but basically the heat pump is something that is very rare in an EV. Most EVs, to heat the cabin, they use a resistance type heater where they flow electricity through some wires. The wires get hot, a fan blows on the hot wires, it heats up the air, and that's how you get heat into the cabin. Well, a heat pump takes heat from one location and moves it to another. This is very common in ICE cars because, of course, the engine, most of the energy used by a gasoline, an ICE car, is with heat. The heat then is wasted, well, by using coolant running through the heater core. A gasoline-powered car can then use that heat to heat the cabin. Well, you don't see that very much with EVs because, of course, there is not a whole lot of waste heat, much less than your traditional cars. But there is a little bit of heat. The electric motors, inverters, motor controllers, and of course the battery packs themselves all have a little bit of waste heat. Anytime you're converting one type of energy to another, you have waste. There's nothing that is 100% efficient. So the Model Y actually has a heat pump that can help take heat from the motor, battery pack, and other components and use that through coolant to then heat the cabin. Now, something that makes it much more efficient, Elon explained that the Model Y has a local heating loop that will heat up first before opening another valve that will then heat up the cabin. And he said that because when temperatures get to below 0 Celsius, it makes it very, very difficult with the traditional heat pump to then be able to heat up the cabin quickly and efficiently. So that was something that is very important with the Model Y, helps make it much more efficient, so that even though the Model Y is 10% bigger than the Model 3, it has a range that is just about equal to the Model 3. So that's something that's particularly interesting. I imagine that efficiency will be realized more in the winter when you're using the heat than in the summer when you're not going to be using the heat at all. So I thought that was rather interesting, that even though it affects the range estimate and that number, keep in mind that chances are you will not get the same range out of the Model Y in the summertime that you would get in the Model 3. I could be wrong on that. They could be working some serious magic and they've got a way to figure it out. I have no idea. It'll be really interesting to see how that all works out. They went on to talk about the rear underbody castings that the Model Y has. Sandy Munro previously, when looking at the Model 3, said that the rear of the car looks like a hodgepodge, kind of a quilt work of different pieces and metalwork that is very, very complicated. So the Model Y actually, if you've seen his videos about the teardown, he's gone through and it's much simpler. It's actually two pieces and a bracket, so three total pieces that the underbody casting on the rear of the Model Y has. And when Elon was asked if the new engineering methods to create that would be applied to the Model 3, Elon said, potentially in a couple years, it's not very high on their priority list. That yes, the Model 3 is a more complex body structure, but then he said the design is, and I'm quoting him here, a pain in the ass, but it's a pain in the ass that works. And I think that's something that slight tangent I love about Elon. He's not afraid of telling it how it is and just getting in there and saying, look, this is what we did. We found a better way. But, to go back and retrofit all of the Model 3 to then have this newer design process and, is much more complicated and would take much more effort and energy than is really worth it. What I thought was really interesting is that design, the casting design for the Model Y, is not common. I would almost say that I don't think any other vehicle is using that. And the inspiration for that was actually the die-cast Model S that sits on Elon's desk. Apparently, he was looking at that going, well, hey, if we can cast something that's this small, why can't we just make it bigger? And so Tesla actually has the biggest casting machines in the world. They have two of them. And I think that's just spectacular, and it really speaks to Tesla's imagination. They don't look at a car and say, okay, well, this is the way cars are built, so we're going to do that. They really take the time to look at each process and go, hey, why is it done that way? Oh, we don't need that at all, or we don't need to do it that way. And a vehicle that really speaks to that, probably more than anything else, is the Cybertruck. And Elon did go on to talk about the Cybertruck, and the Third Row podcast asked a couple questions. And really, if you haven't seen it yet, the Cybertruck is an exoskeleton of stainless steel versus an endoskeleton like every other car is. The exoskeleton is going to be much simpler and much less expensive. And I thought it was really interesting that, of course, Sandy Munro has not seen a Cybertruck yet. He hasn't had his hands on one, but he has worked in the past with an airplane that had an exoskeleton. So he did have some expertise to draw from there, and said that it's much less expensive, much simpler, and he's tried to convince other auto manufacturers to work with this exoskeleton model. But of course, the designers just aren't compelled to be that brave. I mean, obviously the Cybertruck is a very bold design, where even Elon said that he wasn't sure if people would be interested and buy it at all. So if you've got an hour, and I think it's an hour and 13 minutes, so a good chunk of time, I really would encourage you guys to check out the YouTube video of the Third Row podcast with Elon and Sandy Munro on there. A lot of great information and insight into some of the things that Tesla has been working on, how they're thinking about it, but also on the Sandy Munro side, just his experience in tearing down vehicles was really fascinating. I got excited about that, and I might actually watch it again, because I'm sure I can pick up a couple different things that I didn't catch on the first go around. So once again, that is Third Row Podcast. You can search for them on YouTube. They're also on Twitter, I know for sure. But check it out. And in addition to that video, they've got a lot of other great things that are mostly Tesla related. But I think you'd get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So the last thing I want to share with you today is actually about a sports car, an exotic sports car that we're finally going to get here in the US that has been in production in China, by Shantu, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there. That actually translates from Chinese to English as future. So you could say the name of the company is Future. But the car is called the Dragonfly K50, and it's being produced here in North America by Mullen Technologies. That's who's bringing it over. I will be completely honest, this is one of the most gorgeous cars I think I've ever seen. It's an all aluminum body and frame, carbon fiber body, spectacular setup. It's dual motor, all wheel drive, so one electric motor in the front, one in the rear. A total of 280 kilowatts of power and 580 Newton meters of torque. So for those who speak in horsepower and foot-pounds of torque, that calculates out to about 380 horsepower and 427 foot-pounds of torque. So definitely it's not going to be something that puts it into supercar territory or hypercar territory, but definitely being an EV, I think this would compete very easily with some of the lower end Lamborghini or Ferrari types. So sports car, absolutely for sure. And they've gone for some big names in terms of the equipment they're putting into it. So Pirelli P0 tires are going to come standard, which that should easily be able to handle the torque coming from the motors. Brembo 4-piston brake calipers, drilled and slotted rotors. Definitely very high performance equipment. They have a regenerative system they are calling their exclusive rechargeable energy storage system, and that I didn't find how big the battery pack is. I probably should have dug a little bit further on this, but they do say that the Dragonfly K50 should have a claimed NEDC range of 310 miles when you're driving on a consistent speed. That equates to about 215 miles of EPA estimated range or so. So anything above 200, honestly, I think I'm happy with. Now, granted, if you go out and drive this full throttle, pedal to the metal, you know, obviously you're not going to get 215 miles of range out of that. But that's okay, because this is not a car for road trips. This is a car for the track or for fun, or for attention, because I would certainly drive this around town slowly just to have people staring at it and taking pictures and whatnot. Pricing on this should be above $100,000, but likely not to exceed $150,000. I saw a couple different conflicting reports on that. But it's already being made in China. So finally we get to have it too. Should be available later this year in 2020. You can go to their webpage, which is Mullen, MULLEN, USA.com, to really take a look at the further details, learn about the company, because this car is not the only thing that Mullen Technologies are working on. So this video I'm going to play is kind of a promotional video that they put out. There is no audio other than some music. So if you are listening to this podcast in audio only, you're not watching it on the YouTube channel, then feel free to skip ahead by about 3 minutes or so. And then I'll continue after this with everything else for the podcast episode. So I got a chance to get out and about this week just a little bit. Yesterday, when I started to record the podcast, I actually went to a park first and wanted to see if maybe I could give a little bit of variety to the background that those of you on YouTube that you're watching. And while that didn't quite work out all that well, when I pulled into the parking lot and I was getting out of the car, a gentleman came up to me, not within 6 feet, mind you, social distancing and everything, but he actually said, "Hey, is that a Spark EV?" And it completely caught me off guard because I really didn't think that people knew that this car existed. And so we had a short conversation, and of course, one of the very first questions that he asked, which other EV owners will recognize this rather easily, was, how long does it take to charge? So this week, I wanted to address that question, not specifically about the Spark EV, but about EVs in general. One of the more frequent questions that EV owners get, and that I get, is how long does it take to charge? And well, that changes from car to car, and it changes a lot from car to car. Generally, when it comes to EV charging, you can charge on level 1, which is going to be your regular wall outlet, 110 volt or 120 volt of electricity. And what I tell people is usually that will take overnight. Depends on car to car. Some will take 10 hours, some will take 20, depending on the size of the battery, charging on level 1. If you want a faster charge than that, you can charge on level 2, which is your 240 volt. You can do that at home if you have a charger, or you can take advantage of a level 2 charger that's available publicly out and about. And that will cut your time in half, basically. Many cars in 5 to 7 hour range will easily be able to recharge the battery, even if it's a bigger one. And then the fastest way of charging, DC fast charging, that actually depends a lot on what the speed of the charger is that you're plugged into. Some are as slow as 20 kilowatts, some are as fast as 250. Some rated at 350 kilowatts. Every car is going to be able to utilize that differently, however. So you could have a car with a smaller battery pack like the Spark EV. I can go out and plug into a 50 kilowatt charger and go from almost nothing to 100% in just a little bit more than a half hour. Many other vehicles with bigger batteries are going to take longer than that on a 50 kilowatt. But if you're using a faster charger, then those bigger battery vehicles can charge in around the same amount of time, around that half hour to an hour window, that time frame. So if you want an answer to the, well, how long does it take to charge, or how long do EVs take to charge question, that's the long answer. The short answer is it depends. You could say, hey, it takes 10 seconds. I know some people that do that, and then they get looks at them like, what? Well, yeah, 5 seconds to plug it in and 5 seconds to unplug it, and then while it's charging, I go do whatever else I need to do. That might be a little bit misleading, but certainly it has moments where that's accurate. Okay, so that is all for you this week. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to send your feedback via email to hello@ev-resource.com. You can always leave a comment on the YouTube video, and if you want to listen to any of the 11 previous podcast shows, you can find them on the webpage under the podcast section or in any of the major podcast apps. Any reviews that you can give on especially Apple Podcasts would be greatly appreciated. That helps more people that are interested in electric vehicles find this podcast to get their news and information and possibly a perspective that is not something that you'd find out in the other EV world with some of the other EV podcasts. I do invite you guys to engage and have a conversation with me. Come say hi on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. I know your time is valuable and you chose to spend it with me, so I do not take that very lightly. It means a lot. So thank you. I will catch you next time.